I didn't hurt that girl. I didn't do anything to her. Dennis Bowman's voice trembles in the cold Virginia interrogation room. A detective slides a folder across the table. Photos, DNA reports, a life frozen in 1980. Dennis, your DNA was there. You were with her. He shakes his head harder, eyes wet, almost frantic. No, I don't remember that. If I don't remember it, then I didn't do it. His breathing goes shallow. His glasses fog. The detective waits. Are you okay, Dennis? No, I'm not. I didn't do that. The room falls silent. After watching that interrogation, you might actually wonder, is this a man desperately lying? Or desperately trying to believe himself? Hold that thought. Because the truth hidden behind Dennis Bowman's trembling denial doesn't begin in this Virginia police station. It begins 800 miles away, in Holland, Michigan, with a disappearance that haunted a community for 3 decades. 14-year-old Aundria Michelle Bowman, labeled a runaway before sunrise. Her parents searched, prayed, and pleaded for her return. Her photo appeared in the iconic Runaway Train music video. And yet, just like the title, Aundria seemed to vanish into thin air. But when investigators arrested Dennis decades later for a brutal 1980 murder, they had no idea the door they were opening. Behind that door was a secret buried in Michigan soil, a secret about Aundria, a secret that had been hidden for 30 years. How does a teenage girl disappear without a trace? How does a family manage to live with that silence for decades? And why did the truth only surface when detectives in another state connected a murderer to a crime no one saw coming? Welcome to Cold Trail Cases. Before we dive deeper, don't forget to subscribe if you follow cases solved after decades of silence. To understand what happened to Aundria Bowman. To understand how a child labeled a runaway was actually a victim, we have to go backward. Back to the 1970s. Back to a young mother named Kathy. Back to the beginning of a story rewritten by adoption, secrets, and a man whose past was far darker than anyone knew. But before all of that, before the adoption, the name change, the years of fear, we have to return to the night everything changed. March 11th, 1989. A day that started like any other, and ended with a lie that would hold an entire town hostage for 3 decades. It was a chilly Saturday in Holland, Michigan. A late winter evening where the sun set early and the sky dimmed into that pale, quiet gray small towns know too well. 14-year-old Aundria Bowman started the morning at her school's band event. A routine that should have been unremarkable. Dennis Bowman, the strict, brooding man who called himself her father, drove her there in his pickup truck, his jaw tight, his mood unreadable. Nothing looked unusual to outside eyes. He dropped her off and Aundria walked into the school, clutching her flute case, her shoulders slightly hunched the way they often were. To the teachers and students who saw her that day, Aundria was polite, quiet, maybe tired. No one knew she had confided fear to school staff just months earlier. No one knew she didn't feel safe going home. And no one knew this would be the last time they saw her alive. Dennis returned later that afternoon to pick her up. The drive home was tense. Aundria stiff in the passenger seat, Dennis gripping the wheel, each mile stretching out like a taut wire between them. If Aundria sensed danger brewing, she never said a word. She rarely did. When they arrived home, Brenda was preparing for her second shift job. She kissed her infant daughter, Vanessa, bundled herself in her coat, and headed out to work. Dennis took the baby with him, leaving Aundria alone in the house. A brief, ordinary moment in most families. But in the Bowman home, opportunities for privacy had always been scarce. The evening was supposed to be simple, quiet, predictable. But when Dennis returned around 6:30 p.m., baby Vanessa bundled in his arms, the air inside the farmhouse felt wrong the second he stepped through the door. The house was dark, silent, still. No lights, no music, no footsteps creaking on the old wooden floors. Aundria was nowhere. Dennis called out her name, his voice echoing through the narrow hallways. Nothing responded. He walked room to room, searching, scanning the shadows. Then he noticed the details, the small ones first. The back door was unlocked, though he insisted he had locked it earlier. The hallway light switch was untouched. The kitchen counter, usually cluttered with homework sheets and Andrea's half-finished snacks, was spotless. It was as if she had evaporated. He carried the baby upstairs, moving toward the master bedroom, one of the strictest boundaries in the house, a door Aundria never opened without permission. Tonight, that door stood open. On the bed, the quilt lay slightly shifted. The closet, usually closed, hung ajar. And the small travel suitcase Brenda used for weekend trips was gone, missing without explanation. More things had vanished. The cash from their recent tax refund. A handful of loose bills from Brenda's purse. Even the coins from Vanessa's piggy bank. To the Bowmans, it was the perfect tableau. A scene calibrated to say runaway without saying it aloud. Hours later, Brenda returned home. It was nearly midnight when she pulled into the driveway, exhausted from work and expecting to walk into her usual life. A fussy baby, a quiet husband, a teenage daughter who often retreated to her room. Instead, she found Dennis waiting near the door, holding their infant, his face tense. "Andrea's gone," he told her. Brenda's panic was immediate, visceral. She grabbed her coat, keys still in her hand, and bolted back into the night. She drove the rural roads for hours, darkened cornfields stretching endlessly in every direction, empty intersections lit only by the occasional blinking stoplight. She scanned every shadow, every driveway, every patch of wooded area where a frightened teenager might hide. She circled Holland and the neighboring towns until her vision blurred with exhaustion. At some point, Dennis told her she needed to stop, that she had a baby to care for, a home to come back to, responsibilities to manage. His tone wasn't comforting. It was controlling. Still, Brenda drove. She kept searching, desperate, gripping the steering wheel as though she could force the truth to appear if she stared hard enough into the dark. When they finally contacted police, the investigation, if it could be called that, lasted only minutes before reaching a conclusion. Dennis gave them the story. Aundria was troubled. She had fought with her mother. She had tried to run away once before. She had taken money. She had taken a suitcase. The officers looked around. No broken windows. No overturned furniture. No signs of struggle. And in 1989, the word of a religious, church-going father carried weight, too much weight. So the police labeled Aundria a runaway within hours. No Amber Alert. No search parties. No forensic sweep of the home. Her disappearance became a footnote on a clipboard. No struggle. No witnesses. No urgency. The case was handed off to the Youth Services Bureau, the lowest priority channel, a bureaucratic dead end. And in that single decision, quick, convenient, devastating, the truth was buried deeper than anyone knew. Because the runaway label wasn't just a mistake. It was a shield that protected the wrong person. A shield that concealed what truly happened in that house. A shield that allowed a murderer to live quietly, comfortably, unchallenged. While a community mourned a girl they thought had simply walked away, Aundria Bowman didn't walk anywhere that night. She didn't pack a suitcase. She didn't empty a piggy bank. She didn't leave by choice. But back in 1989, no one was willing to question the story her adoptive father told. And without questions, the truth vanished, smothered by assumptions, misplaced sympathy, and a system that failed her at every turn. In time, the search dwindled. The urgency faded. Aundria became another missing poster curling at the edges, another cold case file collecting dust. And Dennis Bowman continued living his life, quietly, deliberately, dangerously, under the protection of the lie he had crafted in a single evening. But to understand how long that lie endured, how it stretched from Michigan to Virginia and back again, how it concealed not just a disappearance but a killing, we can't stay in 1989. We have to go back. Back to Andrea's beginning. Back to the woman who never stopped searching. Back to the moment the wrong family took her home. Because the truth about what happened to Aundria Bowman didn't start on the night she ran away. It started long before, with a teenage mother in the 1970s, a closed adoption, and a man whose sins were already beginning to take shape. To understand the night Aundria Bowman vanished, we have to step back into the house she lived in. a place wrapped in scripture and politeness on the outside, and something far darker behind its doors. From the outside, the Bowmans were the kind of family people pointed to with admiration. A church-going couple with 2 little girls, always first to sign up for volunteer drives. If the pastor mentioned a family in need, Brenda was already organizing the casserole train. Dennis led prayers at Wednesday night Bible study, his voice steady, confident, righteous. In public, they looked blessed. Neighbors waved. Church friends smiled. Strangers saw a picture-perfect family. But the truth of the Bowman house didn't live in the living room where the Bible sat open to Psalms. It didn't live in the photographs on the fridge. Aundria holding Vanessa, all forced smiles and tight shoulders. The truth lived in the spaces no one was invited into. Behind closed doors. Behind Dennis's rules. Behind Andrea's silence. Inside, the house felt tight, as if every wall listened. Dennis kept strict order, curfews, chores timed to the minute, doors locked from the inside. There were rules for everything. The way laundry should be folded, how fast dishes should be washed, the number of seconds the bathroom light should stay on to save electricity. Aundria learned early that mistakes were not tolerated. Mistakes had consequences. And the worst punishment wasn't yelling. It was the waiting, the tension, the footsteps coming down the hall. When Vanessa was born, Andrea's world shifted again. She was just 14, but responsibility fell on her like a second skin. Diapers, bottles, rocking the baby while her homework sat untouched on the kitchen table. She became the default mother, the built-in babysitter. Not because she wanted to be, but because Dennis expected it. And expectations were law. Brenda worked double shifts at times, and Dennis insisted Aundria step up. But there was no praise, only scrutiny, only the constant reminder that she was lucky to have been adopted, lucky to be saved from the life she'd been born into, lucky that Dennis and Brenda took her in. Aundria stopped arguing, stopped asking, stopped hoping, but she hadn't stopped feeling. The incident with her wrist happened on one of those nights when Vanessa wouldn't stop crying and Dennis was already angry about a spilled bottle of formula. Aundria later told a teacher she'd cut herself on a broken toy. But the teacher saw the truth in her eyes. Fear, embarrassment. A plea she wasn't allowed to say out loud. The teacher reported it. The system responded with protocol. A social worker arrived on a weekday afternoon in 1988. Dennis greeted her at the door with the kind of smile that made people trust him immediately. Brenda hovered behind him, quiet, stiff. Baby Vanessa balanced on her hip like a shield. Aundria sat on the couch with her shoulders curled inward, hands tucked between her knees. The social worker spoke gently, asked questions, tried to get Aundria alone. But Dennis never really left. He stood in the doorway. He paced. He offered refreshments, making himself the friendly, cooperative parent. When asked about the wrist, Dennis shook his head with convincing disappointment. Teenagers, he said. You give them everything and they still act out. She's been emotional lately. New baby in the house. School stress. She's always been dramatic. Brenda nodded along, eyes lowered. Aundria didn't contradict him. Couldn't. Because there are homes where children are safe to tell the truth. And there are homes where the truth is the most dangerous thing they can speak. The social worker left that day with neatly written notes and a lingering sense of unease she couldn't quite name. She filed her report the same way hundreds of overwhelmed caseworkers did across the country. She recommended follow-ups. She flagged concerns. She wrote what she could. But a week later, the case was closed. On paper, no evidence of abuse. In reality, the warning sign that everyone ignored. And Aundria felt the shift immediately. Dennis watched her more closely after that. His temper sharpened. His rules tightened. The house grew quieter, not from peace, but from tension. Aundria learned to walk softer, speak less, breathe carefully. Teachers noticed changes too. Not bruises, Dennis wasn't sloppy, but the exhaustion. The way Aundria flinched when someone touched her shoulder. The way she shut down when anyone asked how things were at home. She used to laugh, small and hesitant. By the end of 1988, the laughter was gone. She turned assignments in late. She looked sick some mornings. She worried constantly about getting home on time, checking the clock during class with her leg bouncing under her desk. She was 14 going on 40, carrying a baby, carrying fear, carrying secrets. And every sign, every warning rested in plain view. But people see what they want to see. And the Bowmans were such a nice family. So teachers prayed for her. Neighbors smiled at her. Pastors reminded her to be obedient. No one saw the truth. Aundria was disappearing long before March 11th. Vanishing in pieces, smaller every month. The night she ran away wasn't a sudden event. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't teenage rebellion. It was the final chapter of a story adults had overlooked again and again. In 1988, Aundria tried to ask for help. And the system, the neighbors, the church, the authorities looked the other way. So when her suitcase vanished in 1989, when her money disappeared, when the house fell silent and she was declared a runaway within hours, it wasn't just a mistake. It was the result of every missed sign, every ignored plea, every moment people chose the comfort of believing a lie over confronting the truth. This was more than a disappearance. This was the last warning anyone ever got. Before Aundria Bowman became a quiet teenager in a farmhouse in Holland, Michigan, she was Alexis. An infant with a mother who loved her desperately, fiercely, and knew she couldn't protect her from the world she was living in. Back in 1970s Virginia, Kathy Turkanyan's life was a storm barely held together by hope and desperation. Her childhood had been unstable, a patchwork of neglect and fleeting affection, and by the time she was a teenager, she already knew the world could be cruel and unyielding. Her parents viewed her as a burden. Their patience for her existence had limits, and those limits were felt in every cold glance and every door slammed in her face. At just 16, Kathy fled. She ran. Not far, not free, but far enough to try to carve her own life out of chaos. She hitchhiked. She slept in strangers' homes. She held onto dreams as if they were lifelines, each one fraying with exhaustion, hunger, and fear. In Memphis, Tennessee, she met Randy Badger, a 19-year-old who offered her what felt like stability, a way out, a promise that maybe she could survive. By December of that year, they had traveled to South Carolina, where the law allowed minors to marry with parental permission. Her parents signed the papers almost eagerly, a legal act that felt like washing their hands of her responsibility. Less than a year later, the young couple discovered Kathy was pregnant. On June 23, 1974, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She named her Alexis. For 5 months, Kathy tried to hold her life together. She loved her daughter with every ounce of strength she had. But life had other plans. Randy left. Her parents could not or would not offer the support she needed. She was a child raising a child, trapped in a cycle that was never meant to sustain them. Every night, she cradled Alexis and wondered if love alone would be enough to keep her daughter safe. It wasn't. By the time Alexis reached 9 months old, Kathy made the most agonizing decision of her life. She surrendered her daughter to the adoption system in Norfolk, Virginia, a closed adoption that sealed their bond in legal silence. She walked away, clutching a fragile hope that one day, when Alexis was grown, she would seek out her birth mother, that they might reunite. She had no idea what awaited her daughter. Thousands of miles away, in Holland, Michigan, Dennis and Brenda Bowman were searching for a child to complete their family. Brenda, unable to conceive naturally, had endured years of disappointment, doctor's appointments, and whispered condolences. Dennis, a man whose presence was as imposing as it was controlled, wanted a child. Someone to belong to him, someone to shape, someone to love in a way the world could not. The adoption agency connected the Bowmans to Alexis. By the time she was just under a year old, Alexis had been renamed. She was no longer Kathy's daughter. She was Aundria Michelle Bowman. Her original name was erased from her identity, from papers, from every legal trace. Kathy believed she was giving her daughter a better life. She believed Aundria would have stability, love, and safety. A family who would protect her, guide her, nurture her. That hope was all she had, and she clung to it like a lifeboat in a stormy sea of grief. But Andrea's new life was not what Kathy imagined. The Bowmans presented themselves to the outside world as a perfect family. Church-going, volunteer-driven, helpful, generous. The picture of domestic stability. Dennis, with his reddish-brown hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and quiet, authoritative demeanor. Brenda, soft-spoken, round-faced, warm on the surface but calculating underneath. Together, they offered the promise of a home where Aundria would never know hunger, never know neglect, never know the chaos Kathy had endured. And yet, in giving her daughter this life, Kathy unknowingly handed her to a man with a dark past. Dennis Bowman's charm was a mask, his piety a shield. No one suspected the violence buried beneath his calm exterior, the control, the manipulation, the capability for harm that would one day eclipse the love of a mother who had never stopped watching from afar. Aundria was raised under their roof, and Kathy could only hope, only pray, only imagine the safety she had promised her child. But fate, in its cruelest form, had other designs. Two mothers, two lives, one child caught between them, Kathy powerless to intervene. Aundria, unaware of the darkness she was stepping into, and Dennis Bowman, waiting, patient, careful. A man whose sins were already beginning to shadow the girl he claimed to protect. Kathy's heartbreak was not just in the separation. It was in the ignorance of what her daughter would face. Every day she spent wondering if Aundria had the love, the protection, the chance at normalcy she had never been afforded. Every birthday, every holiday, every milestone was marked by absence and longing. And yet, for all her suffering, Kathy never stopped believing Aundria could have the life she deserved. She never stopped hoping that one day, somehow, her daughter would be free from the shadow she had been thrust into before she even learned to speak. In those first months in the Bowman home, Andrea's identity was carefully, deliberately shaped by others. Alexis was gone. Aundria Bowman was the girl the world was meant to see. She was the daughter Dennis and Brenda presented to neighbors, to teachers, to church groups. She smiled when asked. She obeyed when instructed. She lived within the boundaries they set. But the shadows in that house were long. The cracks in the floorboards, the locked doors, the unsaid threats. They were there from the beginning, quietly, persistently, molding a childhood that should have been hers alone. And Kathy, thousands of miles away, clung to the fragile belief that love could overcome even the worst circumstances, unaware that the man raising her daughter had already begun to shape a very different story, one that would end in tragedy decades later. Kathy believed she gave her daughter a better life. Instead, she unknowingly handed her to a monster. To understand the danger Aundria Bowman faced, you have to see the man behind the glasses. Dennis Bowman, the father in the photographs, the church volunteer, the man neighbors waved to on Sunday mornings, was not the man they thought they knew. Long before Aundria entered his life, Dennis had left a trail of violence that was carefully erased by time, faith, and a community desperate to believe the best of him. It began in 1979. Dennis Bowman, then just a man in his early 20s, broke into a home in rural Virginia. The crime was brutal, a sexual assault that terrorized the woman inside, a home violation that should have shattered any illusion of innocence. The legal system caught him, but the punishment was lighter than the act demanded. Minimal sentencing, time served, and when he returned to the outside world, a strange thing happened. Instead of suspicion, he was met with forgiveness or something close to it. A small community willing to believe in repentance, willing to overlook the darkness, welcomed him back. The following year, 1980, would cement his capacity for control and fear. On a rural road, he confronted a young woman, pulled a firearm, and threatened her life. He had been convicted before, yet the punishment remained insufficient, the warning signs buried in court transcripts and police files that few ever read. By the time he resurfaced in Michigan, Dennis had mastered the art of blending in. A facade of stability, piety, and charm masked the dangerous man beneath. Churches embraced him. Volunteer groups welcomed him. Neighbors smiled. Dennis Bowman had perfected the ability to present himself as trustworthy, upright, and harmless, while the world remained blind to the pattern he had begun decades earlier. It is easy, looking back, to see the warning signs. The obsessive control over his home, the rigid rules, the explosive temper. But in the quiet town of Holland, Michigan, no one wanted to see them. They were inconvenient, impossible to reconcile with the smiling father in the photographs. Psychologically, Dennis was a master manipulator. He understood the power of appearances. A Bible in hand, a quiet tone in Sunday school, a smile at the right moment. He learned early that charm and piety could shield his true nature. In public, he was calm, predictable, even likable. But behind closed doors, he was meticulous, controlling, dangerous. Every decision, every boundary, every whispered threat shaped the environment he controlled. When Aundria entered the Bowman home, the pattern was already established. A man with a criminal past that no one in Michigan could know. A man capable of violence and intimidation. A man whose charm protected him more than any law ever could. Dennis's past wasn't just buried. It was actively hidden, wrapped in layers of trust, faith, and social proof. To neighbors, he was the man who brought casseroles to church events, the father who taught Sunday school, the husband whose wife smiled warmly at every social gathering. He had built a life where scrutiny seemed impossible, where doubt could not touch him. And the disturbing truth? Those closest to him, people who might have noticed oddities, small cracks in behavior, ignored them, rationalized them, or silenced them. It was easier to believe a man could not be capable of violence than to face the reality that the worst danger was sitting in their own community, raising a child they all assumed was safe. Aundria grew up inside this pattern of control. Every chore she did, every moment she obeyed without question, reinforced the facade Dennis projected outside. She was his creation in many ways, molded by fear, habit, and invisible rules. Every smile he demanded, every lie he told others, every secret he kept, all of it built toward the moment when the darkness he had perfected would consume her life entirely. Looking back now, with the weight of years and investigations, the warning signs are almost unbearable. They were there in plain sight. The strict rules, the explosive temper, the suffocating environment, the incidents hushed, dismissed, rationalized by neighbors, school officials, and church leaders. The clues were obvious to anyone willing to see, yet invisible to everyone who wanted comfort over truth. Dennis Bowman's history wasn't just a list of crimes. It was a blueprint, a template for control, for manipulation, for terror, all executed with a calm, calculated hand. And for years, the world around him was blind. It was this blindness that allowed a man with a violent past to adopt a child, to gain trust, to hide behind the mask of religious devotion and public service. Every person who looked at the smiling family photos, every neighbor who waved and nodded, every teacher who assumed discipline came from care, they were all part of the cover that Dennis Bowman had built long before Aundria arrived. And it was this cover, the carefully constructed image of normalcy, that would allow decades of unspeakable acts to go unnoticed. Dennis Bowman was not just a man with a past. He was a predator, patient, deliberate, hiding behind the illusion of a good man. His history, buried in minimal sentencing and community forgiveness, was not erased. It was waiting for a child to enter his home, waiting for the perfect combination of control, isolation, and obedience, waiting for the moment when the facade of safety would meet the reality of terror. And when Aundria Bowman walked through that front door, the pattern was set. The man with the glasses, the Bible in hand, the perfect public face, was the same man whose shadow would haunt her entire life. Every detail mattered. Every step, every word, every smile that concealed menace, prepared the way for what would come. The warning signs were there. The danger was real, but no one wanted to see it. And that was how Dennis Bowman built a house where fear lived quietly, patiently, waiting for the day it would finally consume the girl who trusted him most. When Aundria Bowman vanished in March 1989, the world quickly labeled her a runaway. A teenage girl, they said, with a history of minor rebellion. A girl who would return when the consequences of her flight became inconvenient. That narrative, convenient and comforting, allowed a dangerous truth to remain hidden. For the next 2 decades, Aundria's case lingered in a cold, gray space, filed away in Youth Services Bureau records, occasionally dusted off, but never truly pursued. It was a ghost case, a name, a photo, a memory that faded with each passing year. Brenda Bowman, ever the devoted mother and public figure, did everything she could to keep the illusion alive that her daughter might still be found. Flyers circulated. Tips were called in. Rumors of sightings in neighboring towns, in cities hundreds of miles away, were spread by her hand. On the surface, it seemed like hope, but in truth, it did something far more insidious. It diverted attention from Dennis. It kept police focused on chasing shadows, while the man responsible for Aundria's disappearance remained comfortably beyond suspicion. Meanwhile, Dennis maintained his carefully constructed life. The man neighbors remembered from church, hands folded in prayer, smile warm, gentle in tone, continued to move unchallenged through the community. Sympathy poured out for him and Brenda. Everyone assumed they were grieving parents, victims of a rebellious child's disappearance. Conversations in church halls and grocery stores turned to pity, not suspicion. The very people who might have questioned the Bowman story instead reinforced it. Through the 1990s, the Bowmans moved homes multiple times. Each move, seemingly innocuous, now raises chilling possibilities. New houses, new yards, new basements, places where evidence could be hidden, sites for secrets buried far from prying eyes. The relocation of a family now seen as upstanding citizens created new chapters in a story investigators would revisit decades later, searching for traces of the girl who vanished without a fight. In 1989, Aundria's image appeared in something that would, for a moment, make her presence feel real again. The music video for Soul Asylum's Runaway Train included photos of missing children across America. Aundria's face flashed on screens to thousands of viewers. Some called in tips. Some held their breath, imagining the girl alive, somewhere, waiting to be found. Every rumor of a sighting offered a flicker of hope. Every lead that came to nothing, however, deepened the ache of despair. And yet, despite public efforts and fleeting media attention, the years continued to slip by. No arrests, no answers. Every year that passed wasn't just time lost. It was evidence lost. The physical trail of Aundria's existence eroded. Memories faded. Witnesses moved, changed, died. And the story of a girl gone too soon grew colder, like a photograph left out in the sun until it barely resembled what it once captured. Kathy, thousands of miles away, endured her own torment. Decades of wondering, decades of not knowing. Letters she wrote never sent. Names she whispered in prayer. Every holiday, every birthday, a reminder of the child she had given up, the daughter she had never seen grow. The adoption system had closed the legal door, but no system could ever close the emotional one. Her grief was endless, compounded by uncertainty. Was her daughter alive? Was she happy? Was she safe? Each unanswered question was a stone pressing on her chest. And each fleeting rumor, each report of someone who thought they saw Aundria in Detroit, Chicago, or Grand Rapids, only amplified the agony of hope mingled with fear. Back in Michigan, the Bowmans' careful construction of normalcy continued. In public, Dennis's past remained a blank page. Church members recalled only the fatherly guidance he offered. Neighbors remembered the family that volunteered at the food pantry. And Brenda, ever the protective matriarch, ensured that suspicion never touched him. Her calls to the police, her tips of false sightings, her tireless promotion of leads all pointed outward, away from her husband. In doing so, she unwittingly, or perhaps deliberately, preserved a secret no one could have imagined. And Aundria remained absent. By the time the 2000s arrived, the story of Aundria Bowman had settled into a tragic familiarity. She was the girl who disappeared, the girl who ran away, the girl whose name would appear occasionally in cold case files, sometimes in newspaper retrospectives, rarely in the public consciousness. Every year without progress widened the gulf between reality and perception. The community continued to see a grieving family and a missing girl who had simply chosen to leave. In truth, the story had already diverged from perception decades earlier. The danger had been there all along, meticulously concealed, shielded by appearances and whispered reassurances. And Kathy? She waited, always waiting, always wondering, her hope fragile, her grief unrelenting. She knew nothing of the house Aundria had lived in, the responsibilities thrust upon her, the fear she had endured. She only had the memory of her baby, Alexis, and the belief that somewhere, somehow, her daughter was surviving. This period, the cold years, was more than a pause in investigation. It was a vacuum, a silence that enabled secrets to remain hidden. It was a slow, suffocating erasure of clarity, leaving only shadows and questions. And for Aundria Bowman, it meant that when the truth finally began to emerge, decades later, the revelation would be all the more shocking, all the more devastating. Because the trail didn't just grow cold, it became invisible. Yet, even in those invisible years, the pieces of the puzzle were already forming. Buried in plain sight, hidden in moving boxes, whispered tips, newspaper clippings, and files labeled Runaway. Every lead that went nowhere, every rumor that faded, every tip ignored, was a stitch in the web that had been meticulously woven around the Bowman household. A web that would hold its secrets for another 2 decades. And somewhere, Kathy's heart kept beating in rhythm with the question that would never leave her. Is my daughter still alive? The cold years weren't just a pause in time. They were the years that defined the danger, that preserved the lies, and that set the stage for the truth that would one day emerge, shaking a community to its core. For 39 years, the brutal murder of a young woman in Norfolk, Virginia, had been a cold case. Evidence collected at the scene, fibers, blood, a small swatch of hair, had gone unprocessed by today's standards. Back then, DNA technology was in its infancy. Leads dried up. Suspects faded from memory. The case remained unresolved, filed away under unsolved, a story frozen in time. But in 2019, cold case detectives had a tool that the past never offered: genetic genealogy. A single drop of DNA, preserved for decades, could now speak louder than any witness, louder than any alibi, louder than the careful lies of a man who had spent years hiding in plain sight. When the sample was uploaded to a genealogy database, investigators received a hit, a family tree that traced back through decades, pointing to a single man, Dennis Lee Bowman. For detectives, the realization hit like a sledgehammer. A man connected to a murder nearly 40 years old was living quietly in Michigan. A man who had reported his own daughter missing 3 decades earlier. A man whose image in church bulletins and local news articles had been the epitome of respectability. If he murdered in 1980, one detective said quietly to a colleague, what really happened in 1989? It was a question that reframed the entire narrative of Aundria Bowman's disappearance. The DNA didn't lie. The man in Norfolk had killed before. And now, investigators had to confront the chilling possibility that the same man had been living among a trusting community, hiding his crimes behind a smile, a Bible, and an obedient family. Within weeks, Dennis Bowman was arrested. It was a routine morning transformed into a scene of disbelief. Officers approached his home, a calm exterior masking the storm that was about to erupt inside. The man who had once appeared untouchable was now cuffed and led away. In the interrogation room, Dennis sat alone. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, casting shadows on the walls. Detectives began slowly, methodically, presenting him with the DNA evidence. They told him the cold case in Norfolk had been solved. They showed him the connection, the proof that linked him to a violent act decades earlier. His reaction was a mix of disbelief, confusion, and anger. I don't remember having sex with that woman, he said, voice tight. The detective leaned forward. Dennis, your DNA was there. It doesn't lie. You can't just not remember this. How is this going to look? Dennis shook his head. I didn't do that. I don't care how it looks. I didn't do that. The denial was immediate, fierce, but beneath it, there was a flicker of panic, a subtle recognition that the mask he had worn for decades was cracking. Detectives pressed further, showing him the evidence, the painstaking analysis, the genealogy charts connecting him unmistakably to the crime. Every attempt to deflect, to manipulate, to charm failed. His calm demeanor fractured. His explanations became inconsistent, contradictory. And as they spoke, the room grew colder, heavier, as if the weight of his past were pressing down on every surface. For Aundria Bowman's case, this moment was pivotal. A man with a history of violence, previously dismissed by the system, now faced undeniable proof of guilt in another state. It forced investigators to ask the questions no one had dared ask for decades. If Dennis Bowman could commit murder once, what else was hidden behind the facade of respectability? If he could kill in 1980, could he be responsible for Aundria's disappearance in 1989? The arrest ignited a chain reaction. Files were pulled, witness statements revisited, old reports combed through. Every shadowed corner of Dennis Bowman's life in Michigan became suspect territory. And for the first time in 30 years, Aundria's case was no longer treated as a runaway story. It was treated as a possible homicide, a crime that demanded attention, urgency, and truth. Even as the interrogation continued, Dennis's carefully constructed life began to unravel. His lies, half-truths, and manipulations could no longer hold against the weight of modern forensic science. The detective's voice cut through the tension, measured, unwavering. "Dennis, you've lived decades behind this mask. It's over now. The DNA proves what you did. You can't hide from it anymore." He sat in silence, staring down at the table. For the first time, the aura of control that had protected him for decades was gone. He was a man confronted with the undeniable, with the past he had spent a lifetime concealing. For Aundria's mother, Kathy, this arrest marked the beginning of clarity. The door that had been shut for decades, sealed with uncertainty and fear, had begun to creak open. The same man who had taken her daughter, her baby, Alexis, was finally exposed. The nightmare she had feared all those years ago was no longer a distant possibility. It was real. It was here. And for the investigators, the DNA break was just the beginning. The puzzle pieces were starting to align, the patterns of deception coming into focus. What had once been a cold trail across states and decades was now heating up with urgency. Every unanswered question, every forgotten report, every suppressed warning suddenly demanded answers. The unraveling had begun. Dennis Bowman, the father in the photos, the church volunteer, the neighbor with a smile and a Bible, was no longer untouchable. And as detectives began tracing the connection back to Michigan, one grim reality became clear. Aundria Bowman's story was about to be rewritten, not as a runaway, not as a missing girl lost to chance, but as a child silenced by the very man entrusted to protect her. And the world was about to learn the truth. When Dennis Bowman was arrested in 2019, the investigation didn't just stop at Norfolk, Virginia. Detectives knew the answers they sought were also in Michigan, in the quiet town of Holland where Aundria Bowman had disappeared 30 years earlier. A sleepy community of church steeples, neatly mowed lawns, and friendly neighbors now became a crime scene in their minds. Every corner of the Bowmans' history, every move they made, every whispered conversation suddenly demanded scrutiny. Search warrants were issued for the Bowman properties. Homes long abandoned, yards grown over, basements filled with the shadows of decades past. Investigators arrived cautiously, cameras rolling, cadaver dogs at the ready, senses alert for the faintest hint that Aundria Bowman's fate had been buried in the very earth of her childhood home. Neighbors were interviewed. Some remembered small, unsettling details they had long dismissed. The sound of a woman's voice screaming late at night, muffled yet chilling, carried only across the thin walls of a quiet street. The sight of Dennis digging in the yard under the guise of gardening, soil disturbed at odd hours. Whispers of Vanessa's childhood bedroom being off-limits. At the time, these observations were dismissed as eccentricity. Now they were clues, threads connecting a horrifying tapestry that had been hidden in plain sight. Detectives began to reconstruct Dennis's movements in the days and weeks after Aundria's disappearance. Every outing, every trip, every mundane errand was mapped against potential locations where evidence might have been hidden. The precision of the planning, the calculated nature of the movements. It was as if every step had been choreographed to maintain the illusion of normalcy, while concealing the unimaginable. Cadaver dogs arrived, trained noses sniffing the air, alerting to scents invisible to humans. Ground-penetrating radar scanned the yards, driveways, and gardens, searching for anomalies in the soil, disturbances that could hide the truth. What had once been mundane, flower beds, freshly tilled soil, patches of grass, were now treated as potential crime scenes, each one capable of holding a secret decades in the making. Hours stretched into days. Every inch of the properties was scrutinized. Detectives dug carefully, methodically, aware that a single misstep could destroy evidence that had survived nearly 3 decades. And then, as the sun dipped low in the Michigan sky one crisp afternoon, a cadaver dog froze, its posture rigid, nose to the ground. The team followed, hearts pounding, trowels and shovels ready. The first shovelfuls of earth revealed fragments, bone, hair, items of clothing. The unmistakable presence of human remains buried beneath layers of soil and years of secrecy. For the first time, Aundria Bowman was not just a missing girl in photographs, a name in files, a fleeting rumor. She was tangible again, even in death. And then the horror deepened. Evidence suggested the remains had been moved once, buried, exhumed, and reburied. The meticulous care with which Dennis had manipulated the earth mirrored the meticulous control he had exerted over Aundria's life. He had attempted to erase her entirely, her existence, her identity, her story, but the truth was resilient. It had survived in the soil, in the fragments of memory, in the witnesses who had hesitated but never fully disappeared from the story. Investigators continued the excavation, uncovering more of what had been hidden. Personal effects, small items that confirmed the identity of the girl who had vanished. Every piece added a layer of clarity to a picture that had been obscured by decades of lies, silence, and community denial. The emotional weight on the detectives, forensic experts, and even journalists documenting the process was immense. They were not just uncovering remains. They were uncovering decades of fear, manipulation, and unspoken truths. Neighbors' testimonies became invaluable. One recalled a night when Dennis had been unusually agitated, pacing in the backyard, muttering about keeping things quiet. Another remembered the first strange move the family made, relocating to a new home weeks after Aundria's disappearance. At the time, it had seemed ordinary, a family adjusting to tragedy. Now, each memory painted a picture of calculation, of a man intent on hiding the truth at all costs. For the investigators, the scene was surreal. The quiet homes, the peaceful streets, the familiar landscapes. All of it had been a stage for deception. Aundria never ran away. She never had the chance. The labels, the rumors, the decades-long uncertainty. They had been a smokescreen, carefully crafted by a man who understood control better than anyone else. As forensic teams pieced together the evidence, the story of Aundria's final hours began to emerge from the dirt. The exhumation, the reburial, even the relocation of her remains were deliberate acts meant to confuse, to mislead, to protect the perpetrator. The cold, calculated nature of these actions mirrored the control and manipulation that had characterized her life inside the Bowman household. The emotional toll on those following the investigation was immediate and visceral. Every image of the dig, every careful brushing away of soil, reminded the world that this had been a young life stolen. Friends and family of Aundria, those who had hoped and prayed for decades, were now confronted with the full magnitude of her loss. The quiet tragedy that had lingered for 30 years was no longer abstract. It was concrete, undeniable, and horrifying. And yet, amid the grief, there was clarity. The truth had been buried, yes, but it had not been lost. Modern forensics, dogged investigation, and the persistence of memory had pierced the decades-long veil. The crime, once thought unsolvable, was now being revealed in painstaking detail, exposing not just the fate of Aundria Bowman, but the full extent of the deception that had enabled it. The discovery was, in every sense, a turning point. It confirmed suspicions, answered lingering questions, and shattered the protective narrative Dennis Bowman had maintained for decades. But it also left a trail of new questions. How had such meticulous control gone unnoticed for so long? How had the community been so blind to the warning signs? And most importantly, what could have been done differently to prevent this tragedy? As the last of the soil was sifted through, the team stood quietly, absorbing the gravity of what they had unearthed. For Aundria, there would never be a return home. For the investigators, there was now a responsibility to tell her story fully, to ensure that the life stolen, the abuse endured, and the manipulation suffered would not be forgotten. The excavation ended, but the story was far from over. The evidence collected on the Bowman property would become the cornerstone for the final chapters of the investigation. The confessions, the convictions, the exposure of a community's blind spots, and the reckoning of a system that had allowed a predator to hide in plain sight for decades. And through it all, the most painful truth remained undeniable. Aundria Bowman had never run away. She had never had a chance. The girl who had once been full of life, hope, and potential had been silenced by a man whose capacity for deception and cruelty defied belief. Her story, finally emerging from the earth itself, was a testament to perseverance, the persistence of truth, the power of memory, and the resolve of those unwilling to let injustice remain buried. The quiet streets of Holland, Michigan, would never look the same again, and neither would the world. Aundria Bowman had been hidden, buried, exhumed, reburied, but she was no longer invisible, and the reckoning had only just begun. The excavation in Holland, Michigan, revealed what the community had long refused to see. Aundria Bowman had never run away. She had never chosen to leave. She had been silenced. And now, for the first time, investigators could begin to reconstruct the final hours of her life. Forensic evidence became the voice Aundria could no longer use herself. Soil samples, bone fragments, and traces of clothing all told a story of violence, fear, and meticulous manipulation. Timing, location, and forensic patterns painted a picture that, until then, had been obscured by decades of lies and convenient narratives. The narrative of the obedient daughter, the teenager with a rebellious streak, crumbled under the weight of science and truth. The timeline of that fateful day, March 11, 1989, emerged clearly. Dennis Bowman had driven Aundria to the school band event as he always did. On the surface, a simple act of parental responsibility. Beneath the surface, however, investigators theorized a calculated orchestration. The moment Aundria entered the house that evening, her life changed forever. The evidence suggested a struggle, subtle but telling, moments of confrontation between father and daughter. The exact details may never be fully known, but the forensic trail left no room for doubt. Dennis was the orchestrator of Aundria's final hours. Motive, investigators concluded, was rooted in control and fear. Control over a household, over appearances, over his own carefully constructed image. Fear of exposure after prior abuse allegations that had been dismissed by social workers and authorities alike. The tension that had defined Aundria's life in the Bowman home. The unrelenting rules, the suffocating dominance, the small punishments escalating over time, culminated in this single act. A man accustomed to getting away with violence, to bending truth and law to his will, now ensured that his secret would remain hidden beneath layers of earth. Dennis's lies began to unravel almost immediately. Each statement he had made to police, each narrative he had spun about Aundria's supposed rebelliousness, each claim about where she might have gone, fell apart under scrutiny. Statements that once seemed plausible, the suitcase missing, coins from the baby's piggy bank gone, were revealed as deliberate fabrications, designed to create confusion, to support the runaway narrative, to mask the reality that he had taken her life. Brenda Bowman's role, previously assumed to be that of a grieving mother, also came under examination. Her statements shifted over time, inconsistencies emerging that investigators could no longer ignore. Had she known more than she admitted? Had she participated in crafting the false narrative that kept police away from Dennis? The evidence suggested at least a complicity, whether active or passive, that allowed the truth to remain hidden for decades. Her meticulous promotion of sightings and tips, which had appeared as hope and devotion, now looked like a strategy to deflect suspicion. The community reaction was immediate and visceral. Holland, Michigan, A town that had prided itself on trust, faith, and small-town security was thrown into shock. Dennis Bowman, the church volunteer, the man with the Bible in one hand and a smile on his face, had committed an act so sinister that the town struggled to comprehend it. Questions spiraled. How had they missed the signs? How had a child so clearly in danger gone unnoticed? How had the perfect image of a family masked the most grotesque of crimes? For friends, neighbors, and church members, the betrayal cut deep. Faith in their judgment, in their ability to read character, was shattered. The very people who had shared potlucks, Bible studies, and community projects with the Bowmans now had to reconcile that one of their own had concealed murder beneath layers of civility. Investigators used every tool at their disposal to reconstruct Aundria's final hours. Movement patterns in the house, soil displacement in the yard, and forensic evidence combined to suggest the sequence of events. Confrontation, escalation, suffocation, or physical restraint, burial in a location chosen to avoid detection. Later, the exhumation and reburial indicated a cold, calculated effort to obscure her death. Dennis's previous criminal record, home invasion, sexual assault, firearm threats, showed a pattern of control and violence, a psychological template repeated and refined over decades. The evidence also revealed the psychological horror Aundria had endured in her last moments. Fear, desperation, and the instinct for survival were etched into the forensic record. Traces of attempted resistance, the positioning of remains, and the careful concealment of the crime scene suggested a child who had fought to survive, and a father who had silenced her to maintain his control. Brenda's shifting accounts, the minor inconsistencies, and the deliberate misdirection painted a complex portrait of complicity. Whether motivated by fear, loyalty, or denial, her actions or inactions enabled the crime to remain unsolved for decades. Investigators observed that without her outward cooperation in deflecting attention, Dennis might have faced scrutiny far earlier. The duality of her role, the mother who searched publicly yet shielded privately, added another layer of tragedy to Aundria's story. In court, as evidence accumulated, the narrative became irrefutable. DNA, forensic reconstruction, and the physical remnants of Aundria's last moments formed a damning mosaic. Dennis Bowman's carefully curated life, built on faith, smiles, and small-town respectability, could no longer conceal the truth. Every lie, every misdirection, every calculated move was exposed. The timeline, reconstructed meticulously, revealed that the Runaway label had been more than a mistake. It was a shield. The community, authorities, and even Aundria's own mother had been unwitting participants in a story written to obscure reality. But now, with the evidence laid bare, there was no escaping the truth. Aundria had been silenced, her voice erased, but her story could finally be told. Public reaction to the revelation was intense. Shock gave way to grief, grief to anger. Church members struggled with betrayal. Friends of the family faced moral reckonings. The larger community, once complacent or misled, confronted systemic failures. Social workers who had dismissed allegations, police who had accepted the Runaway narrative without question, neighbors who had ignored warning signs. And through it all, Kathy, Aundria's biological mother, finally confronted the reality she had feared for decades. The daughter she had surrendered as an infant, the child whose life she had hoped would be safe and full, had been destroyed by a man everyone trusted. The pain, once abstract and suffused with hope, became concrete, piercing, undeniable. Her grief, previously framed by uncertainty, was now defined by a brutal clarity. Aundria was gone. Her daughter's life had been stolen. Yet, amid the horror, there was a glimmer of resolution. The truth, once buried beneath lies, soil, and decades of deception, was finally emerging. Justice, painstaking and slow, was now possible. Dennis Bowman's arrest, the forensic evidence, and the unraveling of decades-long deception ensured that he would no longer have the ability to manipulate or harm. The final story of what happened to Aundria Bowman is a narrative that combines horror, tragedy, and the resilience of truth. It is a tale of control, abuse, deception, and complicity. It is also a story of investigative perseverance, forensic science, and the relentless pursuit of justice, even after decades. For the community of Holland, Michigan, for Aundria's biological mother, and for the wider world, the case served as a stark reminder. Appearances can deceive. Faith can be manipulated. And even in the most seemingly peaceful towns, horrors can unfold behind closed doors. But now, at last, Aundria Bowman's story could be told fully. Dennis Bowman's lies were shattered. Brenda's complicity, once hidden, was exposed. And the truth, dark and painful, was finally visible for all to see. Aundria Bowman had been silenced, but her story, her life, her suffering, and the decades-long pursuit of justice would never be erased again. The arrest of Dennis Bowman in 2019 was only the beginning. For decades, the truth about Aundria Bowman had been buried, masked by lies, smokescreens, and the complacency of a community unwilling to question appearances. Now, with the evidence unearthed and forensic science pointing directly to him, the wheels of justice began to turn. Charges were filed: first-degree murder, abuse, and obstruction of justice. Prosecutors painted a portrait of a man whose calm, church-going exterior concealed a lifetime of violence and control. They described the meticulous planning that had enabled him to evade suspicion for decades, the construction of a perfect facade, the manipulation of witnesses, the careful orchestration of a narrative that painted his daughter as a rebellious runaway. Each piece of evidence, each forensic detail uncovered during the excavation, became a brick in the case that would finally hold him accountable. The trial was a spectacle of revelation and horror. Neighbors, once enamored with Dennis's outward charm and Brenda's gentle demeanor, sat in stunned silence as the prosecution detailed the events leading up to Aundria's disappearance and death. Cadaver dogs, soil displacement records, DNA analysis, and the accounts of long-forgotten witnesses all converged to tell a story that had been hidden for 30 years. Every lie Dennis had told unraveled under cross-examination, and every calculated act of deception he had employed came to light. Brenda Bowman's testimony, or her evasive statements, added a painful layer of complexity. Her shifting recollections, the details she had either withheld or misrepresented, painted a picture of a mother complicit through fear, loyalty, or denial. Her actions, however passive or indirect, allowed Dennis's narrative to persist and Aundria's truth to remain hidden. It was a betrayal that compounded the tragedy, leaving the courtroom and the community grappling with questions about morality, responsibility, and the cost of silence. For Kathy Turkanian, Aundria's biological mother, the trial was both excruciating and revelatory. Decades of uncertainty, years of imagining every possible scenario, culminated in the undeniable truth. Her daughter had been taken from her, subjected to abuse, and ultimately murdered by the very man who had promised safety and care. The pain was raw, immediate, and piercing, yet there was also a small measure of relief. The truth she had feared for so long had finally emerged. Justice, however delayed, was on its way. The verdict came after days of testimony, hours of deliberation, and the slow, careful presentation of decades of evidence. Dennis Bowman was found guilty on all counts. The judgment was more than a legal statement, it was a moral reckoning. For the community, it was a confirmation of what many had suspected but had been too afraid or unwilling to confront. The man they had trusted, the father figure, the church volunteer, had committed unthinkable acts against the child he was supposed to protect. Yet even with the conviction, the emotional toll was immense. For Kathy, there was closure but not healing. Knowing what happened could not bring Aundria back. The grief, compounded by years of false hope and unanswered questions, remained a shadow over her life. She had learned the truth, but the cost of that knowledge was immeasurable. The broader community of Holland faced its own reckoning. Families, neighbors, and church members had to confront decades of denial and the uncomfortable truth that appearances can be deceiving. Social workers were scrutinized for dismissing Aundria's earlier allegations. Police were questioned for accepting the runaway narrative without thorough investigation. The church, a cornerstone of community trust, had unwittingly shielded a predator through reverence for appearances and avoidance of confrontation. Each systemic failure became a mirror reflecting society's vulnerability to deception when it masquerades as normalcy. Reforms began to take root. Training for social workers emphasized vigilance over convenience. Police departments instituted protocols for reviewing cold cases, ensuring that runaway cases were not automatically dismissed without thorough investigation. Churches and community organizations were encouraged to implement safeguards against abuse and to foster environments where accountability was prioritized over reputation. Aundria Bowman's story, tragic as it was, became a catalyst for change, a cautionary tale with the power to prevent future tragedies. For the town, Aundria's legacy was also personal. Streets once walked in routine now carried the weight of memory. Schools, parks, and homes were imbued with the realization that the familiar can conceal danger. The community's sense of innocence, once taken for granted, had been irrevocably altered. Yet, amid the grief and anger, there was also a determination to remember, to honor, and to act. Aundria Bowman had been silenced, but her story now served as a beacon, an insistence that truth must prevail, no matter how long it takes. The trial also highlighted the resilience of those who refused to forget. Investigators, forensic experts, journalists, and Kathy herself formed a network of persistence that finally pierced the decades-long veil of secrecy. Their dedication underscored the importance of memory, vigilance, and advocacy. Aundria's life, though tragically cut short, inspired a renewed commitment to justice in a system that had faltered. As the courtroom emptied and Holland, Michigan, began to process the verdict, the larger lesson became clear. Silence enables predators. Appearances deceive. And even in communities that pride themselves on trust, vigilance must never waver. Aundria Bowman's story demanded acknowledgement, demanded reform, and demanded remembrance. Her memory was honored in every subsequent initiative, policies implemented in her name, awareness campaigns, and educational programs designed to ensure that children in similar situations could find protection before tragedy struck. Her photograph, once part of the Runaway Train montage, now symbolized a life remembered not for absence, but for the pursuit of justice that had followed. Aundria's story also reminded the world that truth has a stubborn resilience. Decades could pass, lies could be told, evidence could be obscured, but truth, persistent and patient, would ultimately emerge. And when it did, the consequences were inescapable. The legacy of Aundria Bowman was not merely in her death. It was in the reckoning that followed, the reforms inspired, and the awareness raised. It was in the resolve of a mother who refused to give up hope. It was in the courage of investigators who refused to let time erase a crime. And it was in the lessons learned by a community that had to confront its own blind spots. Aundria had been silenced, but her story would never be forgotten again. Before you go, if you want more long-buried cases finally brought to light, make sure you're subscribed. We dive deep into the stories that time tried to erase. Stories like Aundria Bowman's, stories that demand justice, remembrance, and the courage to confront the truth.